New Hampshire Commissioner of Education Virginia Berry gave yet another PowerPoint presentation on the Common Core state standards to a gathering of New Hampshire School Administrators Association at Bedford High last night. Approximately 90 school board members and district staffers from the South Central region were in attendance, as more than 80 ordinary citizens who were hoping to get long-standing questions about Common Core answered. The night got off to a bad start when Association President Michael Delahanty, Salem's superintendent, told Hooksett State Senator David Booten he could not ask questions or make comments because that was only for school district personnel that could, and I quote, make decisions. In saying with due respect that he too was in a position to make decisions, Booten said he thought it was a public meeting, to which Delahanty said it was, but only association members would be allowed to participate. Sorry, state senators don't count. One of the night's more interesting exchanges took place between Manchester Mayor Ted Gatsas and Commissioner Berry. During her presentation, Berry said the waiver that was being used to give New Hampshire the opportunity to implement the Common Core gave the state of New Hampshire a 2-year reprieve from the requirements of the No Child Left Behind law. She said, all but said, ruined public education. Gatsas asked when the clock began to tick and when it would expire. It looks like it expires at the end of 2015's school year. He also asked what happens if it's not extended, to which Berry said, I don't know, and that they deal with it 2 years from now. In follow-up, Gatsas mentioned that Manchester once upon a time built schools without classroom walls when it was all the rage. Now, he said, it's not the rage anymore, but we still have schools without classroom walls, and that wasn't a good thing. He questioned why the state would change everything, knowing it could go away in less than 2 years. After the meeting, he said that just didn't make sense to him. Finally, Berry admitted again that school districts do not have to adopt Common Core, but she also said that the State Board of Education had not adopted Common Core, that it had only endorsed it, which is why it's voluntary. Well, that got my email box filled with minutes of the July 8th, 2010 meeting of the board, where it clearly says, and I quote, Daphne Kenyon made the motion, seconded by Tom Raffio, that the State Board of Education adopt in principle the final draft of the Common Core state standards and that the Department of Education commit to a thoughtful, orderly transition process for implementation and assessment to ensure that all New Hampshire students experience a successful and productive future. The vote went 4-1 with Chairman Lyons opposed. He expressed, quote, significant concerns over the process, end quote. Those emails also referenced the waiver application to No Child Left Behind, noting the state had adopted Common Core. And gee, it was Virginia Berry who signed that application.
Thanks for being here. Welcome you all, and particularly thank Dr. Berry for being here to talk with us about the waiver and Common Core. I'm Mike Delahanty, and it's my privilege, really, to serve as the chair of the South Central Superintendent's Group. And earlier this year, all of the regional chairs thought it would be worthwhile to bring school officials, administrators, and school board members together to hear from the state's educational leader about the waiver and the Common Core, because there's a lot of information out there. And we're incredibly grateful that she agreed, and Paul has agreed, and Heather agreed to be here this evening. While we welcome everyone who is here, certainly can listen in. We're going to limit the conversation and discussion and questions to school officials. That's why we planned the evening. It's our intention tonight. The people who are sitting here in the front have put themselves in positions to make some choices and decisions, and this is an opportunity for you to have some questions answered or to get some information. Yes, sir.
Sir, with all due respect, the state senator represent a number of decisions or issues about this. That's why I'm here tonight, and I'm offended that you're not going to allow me to ask a question. So
Okay.
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 I thought this was an open public meeting.
Well, you can hear the commissioner,
I
and
want to ask questions.
well, you'd have to find another forum to ask your questions.
So what's
invited to listen. It's public in the sense that it's school district officials and administrators. This is an opportunity. We don't have many opportunities for people in all the districts to come together. This was a date we picked, an opportunity to bring together people with enough forewarning so they could make the date available. We even picked the 5th Monday of the month because we thought that perhaps it would be a day that school district officials wouldn't have a separate commitment. And I appreciate all of them being here tonight. There's a lot of meetings that school district officials have, just as you have them as a representative. But for tonight, it's going to be school district officials. So administrators and school board members, because they're in a position to make decisions.
With all due respect, sir, I am too. I'm in a position to make decisions too. And I have the right, I think I have the right as a citizen of the state to ask questions. And I think your basic premise in the meeting is wrong.
Okay. Yes, thank you for sharing. We're going to stick to school district officials.
Well, you made that point clear.
Okay. No more.
Thank you.
Before we begin, I want to tell just one brief story. I had the good fortune of being a middle school principal for several years. And one day, early in the school year, a brand new teacher wanted to make sure that her kids would know exactly where they had to go for emergency drills. So she brought her kids through the school, showed them the exit route, and then brought them outside and showed them where they would be standing whenever the horn sounded and they had to exit the school. So she was a first-year teacher, just trying to make sure that she knew exactly where, she knew that her kids knew exactly where they had to go. So this was probably the first week and a half, 2 weeks of school. On this particular day, coincidentally, there was a bus parked in the fire lane of all places, just outside the school. And the bus driver was in having a parent meeting. She had finished her route and was in talking to one of her child's teachers. As the teacher was outside talking with her kids about this being the place they needed to be, she finished up and started back in. She was at the front of the line. She said, okay, time to get on the bus. So in she walked with about 6 or 7 kids. About 18 other kids decided they heard her say, get on the bus. And so the kids at the back of the line moved toward the bus, and 4 or 5 or 6 kids in front of them followed those kids onto that bus, until there were probably 15 kids sitting on that bus. The teacher had no idea. She was with 5 or 6 kids leading the line. Common rookie mistake. Always in the back of the line. By the time she got back to her classroom, she noticed that she was missing about 15, 16 kids, and she began to panic. She got another teacher to watch those few kids. She ran back into the lobby where I was standing with an assistant principal, and she said, I've lost more than half my class. So for a few minutes, I was a little unnerved. But at about the same time, the bus driver walked in with those 16 kids. Now, those kids had big smiles on their faces. The bus driver said, you know, not one of those kids could tell me where that bus was going. And that is just like middle school kids. Just like middle school kids. They're impulsive, irreverent, lovable. But not one of those kids could tell her where that bus was going. Nobody knew why they were sitting on that bus. Now, I would venture to guess that nobody here is interested in getting on a bus and going someplace and having no idea where we're going. It's not why we're here. Back in your young adolescent days, I'm sure you would have acted impulsively. But for many years, all of us have been putting on our big boy and girl pants, put ourselves in positions to make decisions. And I believe that all of you here are interested in being informed as you make your decisions. And I want to reiterate that I feel very fortunate to have Dr. Berry, the Commissioner, here to inform us about the waiver of the Common Core, and to answer some questions. I know there are a couple of housekeeping tasks that I need to address. First, in the event of an emergency, there is an exit to your right, my left, and to my right, your left. There's also an exit directly in the back, and there are some restrooms just outside the doors. We plan to go till about 8:30 or 9 o'clock. I've distributed some note cards for you. One group submitted some written questions ahead of time. But in the next 15 or 20 minutes, if you can generate your questions, then we'll be around to pick those up. Dr. Berry and her staff will try to respond. So we're going to give you about 15 minutes to come up with the questions, and we'll take those from you in that time. Okay? So, with that, oh yes.
Are you going to take us out to show us where we stand?
I'd be too afraid that there'd be a bus up there. No, I would love to, but I think you just make it outside of fresh air. With that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Berry with my heartfelt thanks, and I know that the South Central administrators and school board members will be. So, Dr.
Okay,
Berry.
thank you. Thanks, Mike. So thank you very much for being here this evening. I do appreciate it, and I really want to make sure that all of you know how much we appreciate our school administrators, our superintendents, our principals, our educators, our school boards, which I think many of you have heard me say several times how absolutely essential school board members are to the progress that we see in our schools, and also our policymakers. And I'll be glad to talk with you. We have had several public meetings. We met with the House Education group last week. They asked many really good questions, and I'll get a chance to talk with you, and I'll set up a special time that we could really talk together about your concerns and your questions. So tonight's kind of, one of those nights where, I don't want to PowerPoint people to death, and, I want to be able to go through a series of PowerPoints, but really leave the time for questions, because there's lots of questions, there's lots of myths about the Common Core, and one of the roles that we have as educators in our state, not just the New Hampshire Department of Education, but as educators in our state, is to help parents and community members understand the direction that we're headed. I think it's important to set a context. I think everyone in this room knows, and whether or not you're comfortable with the fact that there's a great concern in our nation relative to our students possibly falling behind other nations. So there's varying opinions about that. We do know that New Hampshire students, I want to point right out that New Hampshire students, depending upon which form of assessment we look at, we perform at the 6th highest in the state, in the nation, and the 9th. So depending on whether we're looking at the NAEP or we're looking at NECAP or other forms of assessment, there's no question that New Hampshire is one of the highest performing states in the country. And that's an important issue to keep in mind, because what it says to me is that educators, parents, community members are doing many of the right things to make sure our schools are moving forward. So that's the context I'd like to start with. I also want to just remind people that when we get into the waiver, that I've been commissioner since 2009, also very familiar with No Child Left Behind, the political implications, the implications it has, devastating implications it has on communities in states across the nation. So one of the things that's really important to keep in mind with No Child Left Behind this year, and this will come as a real, sort of for some people, a shock or maybe a revelation, that if we were to have followed the formula that No Child Left Behind, approximately 87% of the 6th, 9th highest performing state in the country, 87% of our public schools would have been failing. And it could have been slightly higher than that on the formula. Next year, 92% of our schools, and possibly slightly higher, would have been failing. And in the following year, like many states, 100% of our schools would be failing. Now, what's really important about that information is we're not failing. But what we are doing in New Hampshire is we're looking at all different types of pathways. So the words that you're going to hear tonight in the presentation is about competencies, it's about student success, it's about the ability of students to demonstrate the work that they're doing. We'll talk a little bit about teacher and leader evaluation. And so I think putting it into a context that we're making choices in our state. And I think that one thing that's really important to me is to recognize that as commissioner, I am very inclusive. I am supportive of homeschoolers. I am supportive of charter schools. I'm supportive of independent schools, and I'm supportive of all of our public schools. The purpose of public schools, public education, is about access to every American citizen. It's about democracy. So public education has a little bit different song a little bit sometimes than people might be happy with. But it is about access to every American citizen to an education. So the key thing is access to a quality education. And as the country struggles with resources, and we look at resources in our state, every decision that we make is absolutely critical. So we have 3 C's. We have great superintendents in our state. And the first C is communication. So communication, communication, communication. Getting out information. Not everybody's going to agree, but that's the great thing about America. So communication is important. Collaboration. So tonight is an example of collaboration. People coming together and making and listening and thinking about what's right for children. So there's no room here for anything more than people thinking about what kinds of decisions are we going to collaboratively, collectively make in our state about the children of our state and about, as many different groups will talk about, workforce development. We're the 3rd most aging state in the country. We are concerned about our economy. We're concerned about workforce development. We have things that we're concerned about. But the good thing about New Hampshire is, historically, the concerns bring about a change process to be able to move forward as a state. Communication, collaboration, and the 3rd C is coherence. And coherence is every single thing that we do needs to make sense. Now, that's an easy thing to say, but it's somewhat complicated because what's sense to one person may not be sense to another. So we like to think that we're making decisions that are in the best interest of as many people, the public good, as we can, as many policymakers are concerned about. So I don't want to PowerPoint you to death. I just want to put the context, get started on it, and we'll leave the time for questions. So let's see. Okay, so this is a house here, and the superintendents in our state challenge the Commissioner of Education and the department all the time. That's the good news. Don't think that there's ever an easy meeting where people aren't saying, but Commissioner, why are we doing this and why are we doing that? So we talk about it. And as Mike pointed out, we have a lot of smart people in our state. And I forget the statistic, but I think we're the 4th in the nation of highly educated people. So things don't go by fast without a lot of discussion. So we created this sort of simple house, and it was really designed to just kind of look at where we are in New Hampshire. If you look at the roof of the house, you'll see one of the things that we're talking about is the future of learning outcomes. You know, people say to me all the time, how can someone graduate from public education and not be able to read at least an 11th grade level? That question comes up all the time. Well, I say, how does a child get to 3rd grade and not be able to read at a literate level? So there's a lot of questions. They go on both sides. So the future of learning outcomes, where do we want to go, and what kinds of graduates do we collectively want to graduate? And then you'll notice on the left, light blue, you'll see New Hampshire College and Career Readiness Standards. This is really important because when we talk about the Common Core is one small part of the standards that we're looking at as a state. We have our own college and career ready standards. Then you'll see educator and leader support. We have an important issue here. What kinds of leaders do we want in our state that move our communities forward, and what kinds of teachers do we want? Competent, caring, intelligent, sensitive teachers that are able to move the complex learning issues of children. So that's another topic we'll deal with. And then, how do we know kids are really learning? That's a question people ask all the time. What kind of evidence do we see that kids are learning? So when the manufacturing groups and the companies say, oh, these kids are graduating, you know, they can't do this, they can't do that. Of course, they never say what they can do. And they never point to the fact that they're just in early to mid-adolescence. But nonetheless, we are concerned about the competent students graduating from our public system. Then you'll see in the yellow left side, their personalization, and then you'll see what kinds of support. Someone asked me right before, I think it was Elizabeth from Nashua, said, Commissioner Barry, we need more tutoring programs. We need to be able to support these children after school. Absolutely. And we need to be able to provide for all students the kinds of support that they need to be successful. Now at the very bottom, one of the things that you'll see is that we have to have enablers. So we have to be able to support these initiatives that we've look at that are going to be critical for the future of our state and our nation, we have to have enablers. And one of the first enablers was the waiver, and I'm going to talk about that. The second enabler was looking at educator effectiveness. Are we graduating from our preparation programs? Are we hiring teachers from other states that are effective? And then you'll see at the very bottom, student assessment and standards. You can't be an effective teacher. You cannot have an effective public education system without high standards and an assessment system that doesn't tell us about students' failures, but tells us about where a student is and what do we need to do to support them. And then finally, on the far right, how do we as a state deal with struggling schools? So this was the house. And it seems really basic. So we got rid of the house. And for those of you who remember The Wizard of Oz, this was sort of a joke this summer. You know, we got rid of the house and we said, wait a minute. We have significant things going on here. How do we really analyze and structure these kinds of efforts to support our students? So, we're going to talk about the flexibility waiver update, what it is and what it isn't. We'll be talking about the Common Core implementation, the kind of support that's available for districts, and I want to underline this, that choose to use the Common Core. In your materials when you came in, I think, and I want to mention I am a mother and I'm also a grandmother. Here is the Common Core math standards, kindergarten to 12th grade. And specifically think about if you have a child, a grandchild, a niece, a nephew, look at the grade level they're in. And those, in this material here, you'll see what do you need to know in 5th grade. What do you need to know to be able to be successful in mathematics as you move on through your middle school, high school experience? What do you need to know in kindergarten? And so on and so forth. And then you also have the English language arts standards, and looking very carefully at what literacy children need to have in our society to be able to deal with the complex issues that they will deal with in their future. So this evening is not about us. This is about all of us making sure, absolutely sure, that children have a quality education. We'll talk about teacher effectiveness, smarter balance, principal effectiveness, and how that all comes together to support student learning. Oops, sorry. So the flexibility waiver. It took New Hampshire close to a year and a half, at least. We fought with U.S. Department of Education because one of the requirements of the waiver to be able to identify our title, our priority and focus schools, was that we had to agree that teachers would be evaluated on one test score. And whether that were the kneecap at the time or whether it was going to be one of our new forms of assessment, which New Hampshire selected, Smarter Balance, which I'll talk about later, we fought with the U.S. Department of Education and on the basis that it was not part of the value system in our state, that we believed that the only way to improve public education in our state was to support teachers and recognize how complex learning is, and to be able to provide that kind of support by better utilizing resources both at the state level and the district level. So the notion of the waiver was simply this: to get us out of a punitive system like No Child Left Behind that was telling the public, our communities, that we're failing children. We recognize that not all children are successful in the current system, but coming and supporting a punitive system that sends a negative message. And I think about this all the time. Over the last 5 years since I've been commissioner, we have tried desperately to get private money in this state, private money. The Gates Foundation would be one of our primary groups, because we want to be able to move innovation here. And given our resource issues in the state right now, getting some private money, not federal money, but private money became absolutely essential. The problem we ran into for the last 5 years is the media. The media and giving a negative perception of the state of New Hampshire, perception of the public about public education. And I can tell you it was very difficult to go to a meeting when you knew that your state was trying to move in the right direction and be told that the public does not support the public education system. And so think about that. That remains really, really critical. At the same time, for those of you who are not aware of this, New Hampshire received unanimously from the Education Commission of the States the most innovative state in public education. So imagine, every day you wake up and the media is telling you the bad job you're doing, or you're not doing this, and then the nation votes the first time in 16 years unanimously that New Hampshire was trying to do and move forward in innovation and recognize that public education has to change. So, a lot to think about. So we have to decide as a state where we are. So the waiver, simply put, was an opportunity for us to redesign our public education system. Particularly, it was specifically designed for Title I schools. The criteria for a Title I school is based on free and reduced lunch. It's based on a poverty index. And so part of the waiver was to identify the lowest 10 and 15% lowest performing schools. And they became known as priority schools. Now, the important thing about that is that it gave greater discretion to those districts that were receiving schools that were receiving Title I, and it allowed them to redesign their efforts, take those strategies that they were currently using that were working, one, or two, begin to look at other school districts in the state, New England, the country, and begin to look at what strategies were able to turn those schools around. So that was the purpose of priority schools. The other element is focus schools. We have some really high performing schools in our state. The focus schools were those schools that were high performing at one end, but they may have students with English language learner issues, and they may have students that have special needs, that there was a gap. And the purpose of being identified as a focus school was to close that gap. And they received funds, technical assistance. Important, very important to us. So the waiver allowed us to begin to redesign and restructure. We have spent an enormous amount of time focusing on the principles and values that New Hampshire holds dear. And we put I really think, ourselves on the line to say that a state like New Hampshire with 188,000 students with a declining enrollment, if New Hampshire can't do it, no state can. And so part of these efforts in this redesign effort is to really understand what works and be absolutely certain these children have a future. And so here we are, lots of questions about it. Smarter Balance, you'll see in 2015 will be the first time that children will be assessed on Smarter Balance, and I will talk about that in greater depth. Right now, our priority and focus schools have met several times with members of the department. We have technical assistance both in our state, out of our state, and those superintendents, principals, school board members have an opportunity to do the redesign efforts in their district. We've not told people what to do. And so it becomes part of the New Hampshire way. Give us the flexibility and local control so we can see if we can make it happen. That is what the flexibility waiver is. Now, I know that there are people who are saying, well, Commissioner Barry, but you're only identifying those schools that are Title I schools that are failing and being successful. That's a challenge for us in the department. And quite frankly, I don't think that using a punitive model is really where any state wants to be, identifying failing schools, as much as we want to be able to identify schools and provide them support. So the notion here is about support, that every child, regardless of the poverty level in their community, regardless of the affluence, have an opportunity to grow. So the waiver is in existence. We have it for 2 years. We're going to be looking at it really carefully. We're going to try our best with our schools to see if we can make a difference in the lives of those children. But it's only good for 2 years. Everyone in this room knows we have no idea what Congress is going to do in the reauthorization, but all we can do is be concerned about our kids and what's going to happen. And you'll see as we move forward. So Common Core. So here's the part that I think is really important. So when the Common Core came out, it was about our state. I'm going to give you the historical overview. Started in about 2008. Hundreds of public educators, university professors from all throughout the nation. New Hampshire was undergoing what's called an alignment, looking at the Common Core standards. Did they make sense? What were they like in comparison to New Hampshire's current standards? You know, educators looking at it. Could they make a difference in the way we think about standards in schools? And so, regardless of what you hear, hundreds of professional educators in our state were involved in this process. Now, one of the things that we've learned in this process is the communication piece. we did not communicate enough to the public, because just like doctors, okay, we're engaged in the work. And so we've learned that if we're going to make these kinds of evolutionary kinds of changes in education, we need to make sure the public understands it every step of the way. So we really, that 2008, when Governor Lynch and the former commissioner endorsed meant we want to look at this, we want to go forward. And so there was a period of time over the next 2 years where our standards were being recognized, were being analyzed nationally, and New Hampshire standards in reading and language arts were considered a C. If we were going to use the rating scale, that's what we were told. And our math standards were considered a D-. So overall, New Hampshire standards were being, by the Fordham Institute, several large prestigious institutions across the country, different groups that were either in favor or against the Common Core, looked at every single state and said, this is your rating, do what you want with it. And that's an important point here. And so we had yet again an opportunity to look at our state standards and determine, were they clear enough, were we able to utilize them in an effective way. And so 2009, we continued our efforts to do the analysis, and then finally in 2010, the State Board of Education. But look really carefully here. We have what's referred to as New Hampshire College and Career Ready Standards. So if you look at the third box where it says CCSS, that's the Common Core Standards, you'll notice that right now only math and English language arts literacy are under the Common Core. We have our own college and career ready standards. We have science standards. And people are saying, are we going to do the next generation science standards? I don't know. Because our lesson was, we need to make sure we vet this with every single person in the state. So we're going to wait and see what the public says. Do we want to move our science standards forward? We'll see over the next year. So we have our own science standards, we have our social studies standards, we have our art standards, we have our career and technical education standards, which have been nationally recognized, and we have our physical education standards. So you'll see the college and career readiness standards are grade level student expectations that have been adopted by the State Board of Education to support student success in core academics, and you can read the rest. So the Common Core Standards is a part of New Hampshire College Career Readiness Standards, and that's an important point I'd like you to go home with tonight. So when we think about our standards, and this has been vetted over and over again, is we want our students to graduate with knowledge, and knowledge refers to the mastery of rigorous content knowledge. And as you probably know, you've probably seen several videos on iPhones and so on and so forth that talk about what the future is going to look like. That students that graduate in 2014 and beyond are students that will have jobs. Now, most of the people in this room will probably have maybe 2, maybe 3 jobs in a lifetime. Research is showing us that these students are going to have 11 to 15 jobs. That we have national statistics that show us people are hired, and at the end of the second year, they are all ready to go to another job because of changing technology. So the knowledge that we learned just a decade ago no longer is as critical as much as a student's ability to research knowledge, to find the place where knowledge can be had. It's still important to be learning in classrooms, but we're looking at knowledge in a whole totally different context. And then skills. And this refers to higher order skills that students need to extend and apply rigorous content and knowledge. So here all the time, can students, do they have the skill set? Not only do they have the math, the reading, the language arts, do they have a context for a foreign language? Are they able to articulate? Can they work on a team? Do they understand how to solve problems? Can they read a problem and develop a solution? Do they understand how to find facts? So knowledge, skills, and then finally, with the help of the House Education Committee, work study practices. Now, some states are calling it dispositions, but we decided in New Hampshire, our way, to call it work study habits. And those are the habits that we want all of our young people to have. The socio-emotional skills or behaviors that allow them to be successful in their career and or their choices in lifelong learning. So those are how the New Hampshire College and Career Readiness Standards. So they're a combination of all the various kinds of standards that we have for our state. And I mentioned already that the Common Core standards are the math and English portion, and then we have the other standards that we currently have in our state. So here just kind of gives you, and this will be online for you to take at your leisure. In July 2010, after 6 months, the New Hampshire State Board of Education adopted the Common Core state standards. What that doesn't illustrate is it was 6 months for the board, but 3 years for the state prior to the final acceptance. The adoption was based on testimony provided by numerous New Hampshire educators, New Hampshire educational associations, and let me add, because many people miss this point, but all of our professional organizations, superintendents associations, principals associations, special educators, early childhood educators, library media specialists were in and thinking about the Common Core before states even started that deeper discussion. They were already looking at what would be the role in the leadership, the educators, and the kinds of technology support that students will need. They were already thinking about that. And in fact, much to kind of our surprise, they were already moving the thinking forward in our schools. The department held over 30 meetings that were well attended from 2009 to 2011 regarding the new standards, including New Hampshire higher education faculty from both private and public institutions throughout the state, and all New Hampshire K-12 educators to examine the relevance of these standards. So, important. They were state-led, they were vetted, and they were voluntarily adopted. So every day we hear this question, must you do the Common Core? And I just got a question from Manchester. We have said from the very beginning that it is voluntary to use the Common Core. And the first thing people say is, but Commissioner, that's what the assessment is based on. And that is true. The assessment is based on the Common Core. The purpose of the Common Core is to give a common language. And I don't think that there's one person in this room, and any one of you who has a professional training background, whether it's engineering, medicine, legal, or educational, that doesn't see the relevancy of a common language. That's simply what this is. It's a common language. We have been challenged about movement in our state, of students moving. And today, and over the last couple of days, we've been looking. We have on the border of our states, actually into the Canadian border, we have tremendous movement of students. It's around 20%, which means, and in the city of Manchester, we have students sometimes moving because of income, housing issues, sometimes 5 times in a year. Now imagine your own child, as I always think it's important to go back to your own personal sense of what this is about. But imagine a child in 2nd grade, or 5th grade, or 9th grade, moving 5 times in a year, for whatever the familiar reasons are. But imagine, and each school that you go to is doing something different. That doesn't mean it's not good, but it means each time that student has to rethink, re-evolve, and reconnect in that environment. So the Common Core is only a common language. Take it up and look at it. And if you can find one thing in this that doesn't make complete and total sense, relevant to scaffolding learning, this is what we would hope all kindergartners, 5th graders, 11th graders would learn as they move through. But really, for our teachers, the ability for the teachers from Peterborough to speak to the teachers in Berlin and so on and so forth, imagine the power behind a common language. And I'll get to that in a second. So the standards are fewer, they've been condensed, they're clearer, and they're higher. And I challenge every person in this room to look at them and see what you think. Now, you're not an educator necessarily, but think about it. Think about what you would expect for a child that you know. Developed with input from teachers, as I mentioned, and it's an opportunity for us to collaborate and continue developing standards in our state. So, the standards, New Hampshire's math and English language are aligned with college and work expectations. As I mentioned, we've had college professors, lots of parents have looked at these standards. They're clear, they're understandable, they're consistent, they're evidence-based. And I have heard many and read articles that said they're not evidence-based. How do we know these standards are effective? We know because these are the things, and these are the things that children, the skills, the knowledge they need to learn at each grade level. And that's evidence-based research. And it's there. We know that if you're going to be successful in 3rd grade reading, you must do the kinds of things that the standards show us in kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade. And when we see that students aren't succeeding, very often it's because the student has a sort of a complicated set of standards that the teachers may not be following. They're not really looking at what the child has learned from year to year. These standards help us look at that kind of chronology. Build upon strengths and lessons of former state standards. We look at our old standards, we look at our new ones. People ask, can we change the standards? If you choose as a district to raise the standards, could you say, well, you know what? We want to have even higher standards for literacy in our district. You certainly can do that. Someone asked me earlier, could we take the old standards, the Common Core standards, and Massachusetts standards? I wouldn't be telling Massachusetts that we're stealing their standards, because I think ours are better. But yes, you can do that. The standards are in the control of the educators and the community and the district. This is a recommendation. And I think over the last couple of weeks, one example is, remember when the body weight index came out? And people were like, oh my God, you know, body weight index, we have to worry about all these things. At the end of the body weight index, everyone's measured by the same benchmark. That's what the Smarter Balance is. It's a benchmark. But all of us in this room have a choice how we want to eat, how much we want to exercise, and how we want to provide ourselves with good health. So think of it sometimes in looking at other methodologies, so to speak. It's new to us, it's change, and sometimes it's hard for us to accept that change process. We're building on our strengths. We are informed by other top-performing countries, and information was shared with us today. It is embargoed until Thursday about New Hampshire's standing internationally, and we're very pleased what we're seeing. We see that we have room to grow, but we see that New Hampshire still remains a successful state. The standards include rigorous content and application of knowledge through higher order thinking. So what do we mean by rigor? This is a big question, and rigor doesn't mean mean teachers, it doesn't mean doing things that are not fun, it doesn't mean anything like that. What it means is that the learning that goes on in school is relevant. It helps students form relationships, both cognitively and emotionally. They begin to see how things are connected. They're about depth. Rigor's about depth. It's not just about cursory learning. It's about getting in there and looking at rich tasks that help us look at things in a very, very different way. The Common Core standards are attempting to increase the depth in what children are learning, we believe, by reducing the number of standards at each grade level. So the nation at large has been criticized for having so many standards that things got diluted. And so the Common Core has helped reduce the number of standards that we're looking at and building on each one of those standards as we move forward. Okay, what the Common Core state standards do not define, and this is important. How teachers teach, we leave that in the hand of our educators and our leaders and our preparation programs, which we have put a great deal of pressure on to make sure the gaps are being filled in our state for teachers that are graduating. All that can or should be taught, it's not all that should be taught. The nature of advanced work beyond the core standards. It doesn't define the standards in other content areas. It doesn't define the interventions that we need to use for students below grade level. It doesn't define the full range of support for English language learners and students with special needs. We need a lot of work in this area. And we are very much thinking and rethinking how we can deal with our English language learners in our state, and also with the help of several districts, asking questions, how can we improve in this area? And everything, it doesn't tell us everything you need to be successful in college or in your workforce. So I'm not going to read this. Well, I will. This is a big issue for people about the cost. The Fordham Foundation put a price tag on the Common Core in May 2012. Projects that New Hampshire will experience $8.9 in additional costs for implementation, $8.9 million. Now, let's go to the next slide. This does not include the regularly planned updates spent by New Hampshire districts in materials, professional development, and educational technology related to curriculum and assessment. New Hampshire schools receive $15 million in federal Title IIA professional development. This goes to every single district in the state of New Hampshire. And $39.235 million in Title I funds, totaling $54 million in federal funds annually. Currently, the state spends approximately $7.3 million for state assessment from state and federal sources. Additionally, the New Hampshire Department of Education has provided training, technical assistance to schools, utilizing CERES, North Country Services, other professional development programs, blended learning. So we're looking at how do we spread all of these resources that we have effectively to be able to promote higher learning. And we're surveying educational technology right now. We know that we have issues in our state relative to broadband and so on and so forth, but we are exploring those to make sure that when the final decisions are made, we're able to provide the support that schools need. So, in the materials that you go online, it gives you getting the facts. It tells you all the things that are important to know about the Common Core. For example, the standards define what every student should learn each year. From first grade, that's a claim. Through SWIFT, 12th and package includes teacher evaluations tied to federally funded tests designed to ensure that schools teach the Common Core. All right? The Common Core defines what students need to know. They do not dictate how teachers should teach and how students should learn. So if you go through the materials, you'll see, you'll be able to dispel some of the myths that you're hearing in the field. And I'm not going to go through these because I want time for questions. Smarter Balance. Okay, so people know, how did we land on Smarter Balance? We landed on Smarter Balance because in order for us to compete internationally, our state was in the NECAP, as everybody knows. We shared the cost of NECAP with 5 states together. And each state was then, these tests were no longer going to exist. And so we had to determine whether or not we would have our own statewide test. That was discussed at great length. It's very, very costly to be able to do that. In fact, New Hampshire would not be able to afford it because we wouldn't receive federal funds. And then we decided that we would go into a consortium. New Hampshire stayed in the decision-making process for 2 complete years. We stayed on the fence, so to speak, that we wanted to be sure that whichever consortium we joined with an understanding that this form of assessment was better than what we are currently using. It would help us better understand how and what children understand and have learned. And so we became part of the governance structure, which was critical. So we have an equal voice in Smarter Balance. And I want to just refresh everybody. If we were to choose to come out of Smarter Balance, we have the authority as a state to do that. We do. We do. But that would be a choice we would make to be sure that it's based on the needs of the children in our schools. The economy of scale, it's a high-quality assessment beyond what any single state can afford. Our state absolutely could not afford its own single state assessment. Apples to apples, it's equivalent levels of rigor across all member states. So all of the states that have joined, somebody mentioned to me, well, states have dropped out. 2 states have dropped out. One of them dropped out, but didn't drop out of the Common Core. So there's a lot of political activity going on. A lot. But in the end, I think in the human spirit, most states are going to make the best decision for their children. And then finally, state flexibility. There's different packages of core assessment, and we'll be able to look at the options that we have in Smarter Balance. So where are we with Smarter Balance? The next generation adaptive assessment children will be using based on the use of technology. It's aligned to New Hampshire College and Career Ready standards and the Common Core English and Language Arts. It's summative. It gives us an end of the year. Instead of taking the testing in the fall, we'll be taking it in the spring of 2015, so we essentially have a year and a half before the assessment. And I want to say publicly, while I'm on TV, that if we have an opportunity to get a waiver to extend the time for the next form of assessment, New Hampshire will go for that waiver. If it became available to us, currently there is a waiver that allows you not to tie Smarter Balance or your statewide test to teacher evaluation. New Hampshire chose never to use standardized testing solely to evaluate teachers. We are using what's called multiple measurements, which the school districts themselves pick. We have no input into that. Another issue that's come up several times in the House and the Senate is, why are we using Smarter Balance? I mean, what was NECAP? Why are we using NECAP for high school students? They don't care about it. We could do better. And so we've listened to the public, And New Hampshire is one of 5 states that is considering the possibility of using a PSAT in 9th grade and using the SATs in 11th grade, rather than using Smarter Balance. And we believe that it will align with our thinking on college and career ready, and that the students will be more likely and parents will be much happier. So we're ready to take that jump. And it'll take working with the U.S. Department of Education to do that. We'll have to fight that through, but if we think that that's the right thing for our state, we're going to fight it through. But we'll see how that works. So the assessment is taken during the final 12 weeks of the school year. It's approximately 7 hours. I hear all the time, it's so much more testing. It's 7 hours, similar to the kneecap as it exists right now. In grades 3 to 5, 7 and 7. In grades 6 to 8, it's 8 hours. In grade 11, so it'll be 8 hours. If we switch to the PSATs and the SATs, we're talking about 4 hours in test time. So where are we? I hear a lot of issues about privacy. If there were to be an award for a state that is the most concerned about privacy, and most of you have heard and spoken at some point or listened or read about Neil Kirk, we have one of the most protected systems in the United States. We will continue to preserve that privacy. And quite frankly, the only information valuable to us as a state is how are students doing? Are they learning? Are they moving forward in their learning life? That's what we care about. The other information is not vitally important to us. The projected cost for the state is similar to the kneecap. It's $22.50, and right now we're spending about, I think it's $22.25 or something, so we're going to go up approximately a quarter. That was a contingency for us to stay in Smarter Balance. All of the states said you cannot go over our current cost. The technology readiness assessments have not been completed. We're working with our school districts. And I want to say that right now we believe that about 72% of our schools in total are ready, and another 10% are trying to get ready. And then we're going to have to take care of those schools that are going to run into, to some issues with the technology. But one way or another, technology is the way the country is going. And so we have to provide, and we'll continue to seek both public and federal money to support our schools in the area of technology. Item testing occurred in 2012, 2013. We had, how many students, Scott, participate?
About 16,000.
16,000 students. Now, all the superintendents that are here and school board members know it was totally voluntary. In fact, Smarter Balance went right to the districts, not through the New Hampshire Department of Education, and said, would you like to participate? 16,000 students participated, and we're waiting to see how our students did. And I won't name the district, but I was up in the North Country recently, and the superintendent said to me, well, we did something really smart. I said, what is that? He said, we had our best math students take the math part, and we got some really good feedback about that. So districts had that choice. And we'll see how our students did. Now I want to share just a little story that I think just to give a little humor. You can see people are very serious. But I went to visit Ware back in June, and it was like a 103-degree day. And it was 5th graders. They invited me to come there. And I was with the superintendent, there were teachers, there were parents. And we're sitting in the library, and the first question, and it was a plant question. They always plant questions with the kids. The first question was, Commissioner Barry, what do you think of the kneecap? And I said, well, I don't think I'm going to talk about the kneecap because we're going to have a new assessment. And I said, the new assessment is called Smarter Balance. So, kids kind of looked at each other. I said, well, what do you think that means? So they thoughtfully stopped for a second. And then one little 5th grader raised her hand and she said, well, smarter is like, and you know how if you've seen those AT&T shows on TV, she had her hands and she was so engaged. She said, well, smarter is like you're smart, but you really want to be smarter. And the students all shook their heads and, they listened to that. So I said, well, what do you think balanced means? Well, things got a little more quiet. And then one young 5th grader boy said, well, balance is this. Balance is like when you want to ride a bike. And you think it's your hands and your arms. But it's really your hands, your arms, your brain, and your eyes working together to ride a bike. And all the students started to, they were pretty good. They were really thinking about that. So then I gave them a question from Smarter Balance. And the question was, imagine every 2 weeks that you receive $20 from your parents and your family for doing really well in school and helping at home. And that's one of the Smarter Balance questions. And then you have to take 10% every 2 weeks out of your $20 to save for college. And so that was a pretty easy one for fifth graders. They all calculated it really quickly. And I said, well then, at the end of the month, how much money would you have if you take the 10%? Meaning they have to do 20% now of the total. I said, well, how much would you have at the end of the year? Well, the group kind of, now they had to start talking to each other. They calculated in their heads, no paper, no pencil. And so then we proceeded to ask questions. And so just as we're finishing up the amount of money, one student raised his hand. He said, Commissioner Barry, I said, what? He said, it doesn't matter. If you took 20% over 10 months for 13 years, you still wouldn't have enough money for college. Okay? So kids are smart. Smarter Balance is helping us see a different way that children learn. It's not the old sit at a pencil, paper thing, check off the box, use your number 2 pencil. It's different. And if you get a chance to go online and look at the questions, you'll see what it's different. And it's going to raise the bar. That's what Rigor's about. It's not about knowing what kids don't know. It's about knowing what they do know so that we can make sure that they have the supports as they move forward. So, much to do about nothing. We're going to get better and best at the work that we do. Practice tests are available at the Smarter Balance website. Not adaptive, but they look and kind of feel the same. Go online. Take the test. There's a great one for swimmers here. Look at the swimming question. When they talk about how many meters a student can swim, the swimmer can swim in 1 hour. It's very, very fascinating. So we field tested in next year, 2014, and then we'll have instructional support library available in 2014, full implementation in 2015, and the timing of Smarter Balance is approximately the same as reading and math and kneecap assessment. So I mentioned that before. So we're not over-testing. We believe this form of end-of-the-year testing, summative assessment, will be much more vitally important to plan each year. Okay, now I'm getting to the end so we can get to questions. So, teacher evaluation, New Hampshire led the country, and I'm very proud of this because this gets back to collaboration. Instead of saying we're going to fire all our teachers, 50% of the kids don't do this on tests and things like that, we said was, you know what, we need to really look at this. We need to really come together and collaborate and decide what would be really good to help teachers get better. Now that was an interesting notion across the nation. So 68, 72 people met 2 and 3 times a month, principals, parents, PTA, policymakers. We had a lot of active involvement. And over a 3-year period, we developed a system that is based on evaluating teachers on their understanding of learners and learning. What are 7-year-olds like, 14-year-olds like? What are kids like? What are learners about? How do they learn? We learned that teachers have to know their content. They have to understand mathematics to teach mathematics. They have to understand context and literature. They have to have a skill set. We looked at the instructional practices. Our teachers graduated with 5 different ways to teach reading. And can only one way of teaching reading, a small repertoire of understanding, meet the needs of all children. If we're talking about personalization, then we have to have teachers that can personalize learning. They can't stick to one way of teaching reading or math. They have to have a much larger repertoire of interventions. And then we looked at professional responsibilities. And we worked very closely with our unions. I'm very pleased to say that. We had tremendous open conversations with our unions. And then finally, it was all about student learning, that we agreed as a state to define what a good teacher is, what an effective teacher is, and what we want them all to do. And I think over the next decade, we'll see that New Hampshire will continue to not only be in the 6th or 9th, but lead the nation in this important work. For Title I schools, they were required to use 20% based on assessment. They're receiving a lot of federal dollars, but they still could pick out the assessment that they wanted to use. They didn't have to use Smarter Balance. They could pick out those assessments, help them to understand whether or not the teacher is effective. Principal, you don't expect to read this, go online. And so principals, what we did was we got our principals to Principal Association. The department had nothing to do with it. And I always say this, my favorite line from my husband, who's been a selectman for 38 years, is, I'm from the state, I'm here to help you. And now that I work for the state, I understand that's not the way people think about it. So we didn't get involved in principal assessment. We gave it to the Professional Principals Organization and said, you develop a tool that helps us know whether you're a good principal, whether you're willing to let parents into your school, whether you understand what teaching's about, so on and so forth. So this tool was developed by our principals and is being used voluntarily throughout our state, with the exception of Title I schools. They must have an evaluation. Because one of the things that we do know is, if you don't have an effective leader, you don't have an effective school. And so leaders are important. So get a chance to look on with that. And there you see the Title I schools. So finally, and then we'll get to our questions, there's only 3 ways to improve student learning. And this is research from Stanford to Harvard, international research. All right? So the house we showed before. The house is gone. This is the way we're looking at learning in our state. First and foremost, the first thing you need to do is you can raise the level of the content that students are taught. You can increase the skill and knowledge that teachers bring to the teaching of the content. And you can increase the level of students' active learning of the content. That's it. Everything else is just purely instrumental. That is, everything that's not in the instructional core can only affect student learning and performance by, in some way, influencing what goes on inside the core. Schools don't improve through political and managerial incantations. They improve through the complex and demanding work of teaching and learning. So, this is how we're seeing learning in our state. First, meaningful content and skills. Meaningful content and skills, not wasting these kids' times with the repetition that sometimes goes in, but meaningful activities, meaningful things that all of us would want to be engaged in. Instructional quality, high-quality teachers and leaders. Student engagement, engaging students in their own learning. Having them take responsibility for their learning and having them in an environment where learning means something. And then you'll see, in the middle, rich task. How are schools going to change as we move on to be sure that the tasks we're giving students are going to help them to be better at thinking, much more complex in their thought process? So, when we talk about meaningful content, we talk about New Hampshire competencies, we talk about New Hampshire College and Career Ready standards, and some of you may be talking about the Common Core, pieces of it. Right? That's meaningful content. It's been tested all over this country. When we talk about instructional quality, it means a fair evaluation system for our teachers and leaders. It talks about preparation programs, both public and private, preparing teachers. We are going to lose approximately 38.79 teachers over the next 4 years. It's huge for our state. We need to make sure that teachers are coming prepared, ready to go, ready to teach. It is a very costly endeavor to have teachers graduating that don't have the skills that they need to be successful in their beginning years of teaching. And then professional development and induction. During those first couple of years, collegially we come together to support our teachers and to be able to identify those that will be most successful. And over here, student engagement. Many of you are familiar with ELOs, having more extending learning opportunities in schools, college and career readiness standards, and students having a voice. You may not be aware, and I'm not prepared to give you statistics, how many students are in Running Start. I think it was 23,000 credits generated last year through our community college system. Students taking AP classes, taking classes to graduate early, taking classes to make up missed courses, taking classes where they failed, where they want to be able to be successful. So student voice is important. How do we match their needs to be able to move them forward? So all of the reforms are organized. And that's what we learned. That everything we do, we just can't keep layering and layering. We have to say, what are our goals? Standards, meaningful learning, and student engagement. That's how we're codifying everything that we're working on. And every district is doing it as they choose. Now, some need technical assistance and more support, and some of them are leading our state. We have what's called the Innovation Lab Network in our state, which is very exciting, and I hope that there'll be a day when people will ask the department to come and talk about the great things that are going on. Everything we do is interrelated and interdependent. So the following This following graph kind of gives you one more look. Common Core, competencies, student learnings, quality performance. So here we are. Just think to start at the top left, we have a meaningful learning goal. We have high quality assessments. We have student competency at the core. We want students to be competent at each level as they progress, not just at grade levels, but as they progress in their development. We have proficiency targets that we've identified that says, this kid's pretty close, or this kid's really proficient, or doing extremely well. How do we give them more in their learning? Student accountability, one of our goals is to get our students to be fully engaged in their learning. I hear all too often from people who say, but the students don't care. Yeah, they do, but they have to be in an environment that makes sense to them, that they want to be fully engaged. Student learning objectives, you'll hear about that. Targets, and then teacher accountability. So all of these come together. So that's it. So we'll be glad to have questions. You want to begin? Okay, well, I can start this one. It says, why was the New Hampshire School Board, rather than the local school board, chosen to vote on whether or not to accept the Common Core? The New Hampshire State Board of Education did not vote. What they did was endorse the Common Core. And from the very beginning, and several of you have asked for minutes and notes and whatever, it's in the notes. You have a choice not to use them. Now, the first thing people say is, but Commissioner Barry, the test is based on them. That's true. So get back to body index. You have your choices. You can mix them up, you can develop them yourself, and it's really up to you. But that's the core that we're looking at. Yes, Mayor Gatzis.
Thank you, Commissioner. At the very beginning of your presentation, you talked about 2 years. Can you tell me when the 2-year window began? We're going through this entire change educationally. In 2 years, the federal government throws up its hands. What do we do?
Well, I don't know. We'll decide when we get there. It hasn't really been 2 years. It's been 2 years since they endorsed it, but we're now moving into 2014. So it's been, we have, just for your own edification, we have several school districts that are in their 3rd year of implementation of the Common Core. We have many that are in their 2nd, and we have some in their 1st, and we have some that have still not gotten off the ground. So obviously we need to give our attention. I do not believe that, because first of all, the federal government is not leading this, the state of New Hampshire is. We're leading it for ourselves.
That's my question, because we still have a school in the city of Manchester when everybody said it was wonderful to build schools without walls. We still have that school without walls. And my big concern is that we go through this discussion, and maybe what we need to do is implement, instead of whatever standards you want to call them, Manchester standards. Because if 2015 comes, and we still are waiting for a waiver not to have to test students that aren't even proficient in their own language, then we can step back and tell the federal government, we don't want to play in this.
Yay!
The question is, what will be the requirements and responsibilities of librarians, media specialists as related to the Common Core?
Well, that question, library media specialists all over our state, we have very, very talented library media specialists. Most librarians today are at the core, at the heart of helping students develop research skills and utilize technology in an integrated way. So their role will be very pivotal, I believe, and I think that you would see that kind of support throughout the state.
Will smarter balanced assessments be posted for review after the assessments are complete?
Right, after the assessments are completed, there will be, how do they refer to it? So, released items from the test. You will have access to the released items.
The states can add, in quotes, 15% to the standards. Have we added anything? If so, how will they be assessed?
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, every state, we've identified our own New Hampshire College and Career Readiness Standards, and we're only using the English Language Arts and Math Standards. And I suspect that over the next 5 years, that we'll continue to reevaluate on a yearly basis the standards, because we'll need lots of feedback on them, and we can add to them as we choose.
Did any content-specific professors from the UNH system review the Common Core standards? If so, what was their assessment? If not, why not?
Okay. Yes, we had both public and private institutions. We held, as I mentioned before, several meetings on the UNH campuses, UNH Manchester, Keene State College, Plymouth State, UNH Durham. We held them at New England College, and yes, professors were involved. The interest of professors specifically was, do these standards meet what they're looking for in terms of entrance of competency? And as you know, math is a concern in our state, and we've gotten very positive feedback from higher education on the standards. In fact, remember, higher education was involved in the development and the assessment of them when they first came into play in 2008.
I think you addressed this, but I'll ask you. Must we pay Smarter Balance for the assessment per student, or are there more cost-effective alternatives?
Okay. We believe, and certainly people want to talk more about this, but we believe this to be the most cost-effective because we'll be sharing with other states a Smarter Balance just like we did with NECAP. For a state to be able to take on a single test themselves, if you look at those numbers, it's an enormous cost.
Can you comment on the amount of time our students spend being tested?
Yeah, I think I did answer that question, and it will be almost identical to the current NECAP, but at the high school level it will be different because if we do choose as a state to go into PSATs and SATs, there'll be a reduced time. I think it's 4.5 hours or less. It's like around the 4-hour point.
What kind of resources are available to address the technological requirements of Smarter Balance? Computers, service upgrades, etc.
Right. So we have Dr. Scott Manti, who is here from the department. He's the coordinator of Smarter Balance. We've been working closely with our districts to identify those districts that need additional hardware and so on and so forth. Some districts that don't have the broadband capability, we're looking at companies that would provide hotspots until we get the broadband into those areas at a cheap cost. So we're doing those kinds of things to support districts. We can use a paper and pencil in the first couple of years. We're hoping not to. We're hoping to get private money into the state so that we can have all of our students assessed from a technological standpoint. And that is our goal, because we really want the best form of assessment that works best for the students. Do you want to add anything, Scott? Or? Good.
Will your PowerPoint be made available for districts?
Yes, it's on the back right at the very end. Let's see, I'll just get to this. There it is right there. It is available and it's online. You can go ahead and get the entire PowerPoint. There's several PowerPoints. There's an entire section on Common Core, and it's all there.
Please explain to those critics who are calling Common Core, quote, watered down education, how this is not the case.
Well, I think I illustrated that. I won't bore anybody with the response to it again. I think that if you were to take these out and look very carefully at a grade level, just pick one, you'll see that it's hardly watered down material.
How will college admissions be impacted, whether positively or negatively, with the adoption of Common Core by New Hampshire and other states, as well as the lack of adoption of Common Core in a number of states?
Well, so far, Common Core, how many states have dropped out? 2 states, and we believe that as our students, and remember, we're having a hard time keeping our students in our state because we are the lowest paid, lowest support of higher education, second lowest in the country. So working with what we refer to as a seamless system, K through 20, is really important to us because if we're going to keep young people in this state, we have to have affordable higher education. And we have to have students that go in ready to learn. And they need to go in not taking remedial classes. So it is important to every single citizen of the state of New Hampshire to have a system that makes kids and gets them prepared. Right now we're looking at early college, which means that we are considering, we have several districts that are going to offer the first year of college on site at a very, very inexpensive cost. We have Dr. Nate Greenberg, who's leading that charge to determine whether or not early college is something. So we're looking all of the time for new systems that help us to move kids that are ready and provide support for kids that need more support, but make sure that they're ready for their future.
What flexibility do districts have to adopt curriculum and utilize resources that stretch beyond the Common Core if they have if they have decided to adopt that
Yeah,
standard?
total flexibility, and I would ask all of the school board members, I think most of you are aware that there's been absolutely no rules, regulations imposed on any school district to develop, implement the Common Core. It's really been in the hands of the districts. And as I mentioned, many are in their third year, some are in their second, very few are in their first, and we have almost just very few districts that are still need a lot of technical support if they choose to go to the Common Core.
Critics of Common Core, Smarter Balance, are concerned about the privacy of student data. What are the plans for sharing New Hampshire student data?
I mentioned before that we have maintained very strict privacy rules, and we expect to continue that. And Scott, would you mind sharing what New Hampshire did this past week? That we were the only state in the country. Would you just illustrate that?
Actually, New Hampshire was the first state in the Smarter Balance Consortium to bring about this question of privacy, simply because we weren't comfortable with some of the statements that were being made by Smarter Balance. So we led that charge in trying to get a very precise way of defining exactly the kinds of data that would fit with the kind of data we were willing to release. So we've in essence been part of Smarter Balance, so that they've come ahead and made a statement that has said that the states maintain complete control of the data, and no data can be released without state approval.
And
Who determines that?
And we actually that came up about parents being involved. In the past, the parents have never signed off on their kids being assessed. Is that correct? Yeah. So that would be a district decision if you choose to have your parents decide. But we still have to have a participation rate as a state on the number of students that are assessed. And that information is vitally important in terms of curriculum and instruction. I don't know, is there another way to kind of respond to that?
I think this one might be a challenge. What is the total estimated cost to school districts of Common Core implementation?
We have continuously surveyed our districts. And again, if you go back to those that are in their 3 years of implementation already, those districts probably have very effective planning. And there's superintendents and school boards here. It was really up to the district how they wanted to use materials, but I will tell you that the professional organizations nationwide encourage superintendents, principals, library media specialists, curriculum specialists not to go into heavy purchasing, to wait until the Common Core was rolled out and make a determination about whether they were aligning or not before they purchased materials. So I think there was a very conservative approach in the state of New Hampshire to the actual purchasing of new materials to get started on the Common Core.
Okay, the next two questions are similar in nature. Was there any comparison between Common Core and standards in Massachusetts that were widely accepted as best in the country? Did you address that?
Yeah, I think I addressed that also. I don't know how else to address it. I put it in there. We looked at state standards. We looked at Massachusetts. Massachusetts has their own state standards. And I talked to many policymakers in our state, and New Hampshire is, we are, from an index, if you were to look at it just on a visual, we are just slightly in our performance below Massachusetts. But on the NAEP exam, the results will be put out this week. You'll see some very interesting results. So, looking at Massachusetts, looking at Maine, looking at New Hampshire, we can look wherever we want. There's no, there's no prevention from doing that.
Again, I think this was addressed, but perhaps it's worth repeating. Are New Hampshire districts free to not adopt Common Core, but establish local curriculum and assessment standards that comply with ED 306? What are the consequences of non-adoption?
You are free to do it. I think I've said that several times this evening. The consequences are totally in your hands. If you choose to, again, try to think of some metaphors in your mind or different analogies. If you choose to develop your own standards and you believe that they are high standards and you feel that they've been vetted and they're clear and the teachers understand them and you've had experts look at them and so on and so forth, then you are certainly ready to take on your own standards. If you'd like technical assistance to adopt several elements of the Common Core, New Hampshire College and Career Readiness Standards, and so on and so forth, you can get more technical assistance. But it is at the local district level to make that decision.
Many groups, including the NEA, AFT, NSBA, and others, have called for a 2-year moratorium on high-stakes assessments and consequences. Will we do that in New Hampshire?
Okay, I mentioned the first thing tonight that I said that if there was the possibility of having an extended waiver for testing, we would do that. We would go forward. But I really want to point out something. Does anybody know anybody that was shot as a result of their NCAT scores? There is no punitive element of an assessment. The only function an assessment, a good assessment plays, is to tell us where the student is and how we can do better. What better instructional work that we can do to support them. That's the only function it plays. Now, I know there's lots of people in our state, and now I'm going to go off a little bit on a political thing here, is that they want to know who's the highest performing and who's the lowest, who's in the middle. Well, if that's information is important to you, what I think is important is each individual district looking at their own children. And while it is fun sometimes to compare yourself to another equal district, but when I think about the kids in any school, what they need is the support from all of us to perform and have the best standards and have an assessment that helps us be better at instruction. So to me, that's what's really important. It's not about who's the best or the one that's having the most problem. It's about, let's get to, as I mentioned before, the struggling schools, and like Mayor Gatz has said, is on me on a weekly, daily basis. We have to understand better how do we work, in an urban school, in a rural state that's, experiencing many different demographic issues. We need to get better at that, and I don't think anybody would shut that down. But I don't know if I answered that question, but I really want to reinforce that an assessment is simply an assessment. There's no punitive element of it.
If Common Core is implemented, what curriculum role is left to school boards?
As I mentioned earlier tonight, we appreciate our school boards. You work with your superintendents, your principals, your instructional leaders to make those decisions as to how you want your district to develop curriculum. And that's really still in your hands. There's never been an attempt. I do think one thing that's very commendable are school board members that are looking at effective practices and looking at districts that are really, moving forward, and we start to share. And school board members can play a really integral role in that. What's working? What are we doing that's great, and what is this district doing that's great? How can we make our state great collectively by looking at best practices? That's, to me, the valuable role of school boards that lead their community. And as I mentioned in the slide, not in a political, managerial way, but they're looking at the big picture, and they're really focused on the kids in their district. I had a superintendent once, and I always remember this, and he said, these are our kids. We're not shipping them in from the other town. We have to worry about our kids and their success in the future, and that's what's important for school board members.
How is the NCLB waiver even possible? How is anyone ever waived from a law?
Right. Well, it happens. Washington. So the waiver allowed us, there was a lot of fight about whether it could happen, but we were able to get the waiver to remove us and to allow us again to redesign the state of New Hampshire's educational system. So it happened, and like I said, we fought for 18 months to get it for all of you and for the children in our state.
Will districts lose state and or federal funding if Common Core is not adopted?
No. No. You do have to participate in the assessment. We have SB 48 that requires, Senate Bill 48, that requires every student in the state of New Hampshire to participate if they're in public education in assessment. And also it does impact on other elements of funding, but only assessment, not the Common Core.
What does Common Core do to FERPA?
Well, it, I think, kind of illustrated the protection. It does nothing. Common Core does nothing to FERPA. The New Hampshire Learning Standards did nothing to FERPA. FERPA is in the hands of quality people that recognize. In fact, most people don't know this, the Commissioner of Education. There are only 4 people in the entire department that have access to student data, and they have to sign an oath. I and myself and none of my staff, other than Scott, who is required by state and federal law to have access to the student SASI numbers, but we do not know children by individual at all, and that is very limited access, so it has no impact on FERPA.
You've used the term priority and failing, the terms priority and failing interchangeably. Are you implying all priority schools are failing?
Just getting back to the original point, and that is when we participated in the waiver, priority schools were determined by the lowest 10% and the next 5%, lowest 15% of schools that were in Title I that had not made growth over a period of years. And so that's how those schools were identified. I want to say, and I've said this several times publicly, that those schools that were willing, Title I schools had a choice not to participate in priority and focus. They have a choice. They were not required to do it. So a district, along with the school board members, made that choice. If you participated as a Title I school, you were able to receive additional federal dollars to provide technical assistance at your choice to make decisions that were best for your school district to engage in higher levels of student performance. So it was full choice. It was up to you to decide to do it.
Prior to tonight's presentation, a state policymaker said to everyone she was voting against Common Core. What communication has been shared with the legislature regarding Common Core? And what would the legislator be voting on if Common Core is voluntary by district?
Well, that's good. Let's go with the last one first. I don't know what they'd be voting on since it is voluntary and it is local control. But we have had several, we have some House members in the audience, we've had several meetings over the last 2 years, communication with our House and our Senate. We have made ourselves available individually, if the Senator wants to meet individually. We put on presentations, we brought guest speakers in, we brought people from other states, we've provided a balanced approach. Again, depending on people's political position or how they view things, we'll make a determination. But that access to information has been consistently made available to every citizen that has made a request, including individual people sitting down one-on-one with people that really had, concerns. And they want to be sure. They want to be absolutely sure that we're making the right decision. And I believe we have the right to do that.
Every set of math standards I've read have made sense. New Hampshire students have performed in the top 9% of the country. How do the Common Core make more or different sense, and why change if we're already doing so well?
Okay, so well is defined in different ways. Let me just go back again to Common Core. They're clearer, they're higher, they offer more rigor. And in fact, while we are performing well in math, our math scores overall, if you were to look at it in a curve, we kind of go like this to around 7th grade, and then we start to move down a little bit. And so we know that these standards are going to offer more consistency in teaching, as kids move through the standards. So we believe that over the next 5 years or so, we should see an increase beyond 7th grade in our math scores. And I think that will be determined also if we decide on a PSAT and SAT for our high school students. We'll start to see overall math performance. So good is good. Good can be better. Better can be best. I mean, I just think it's a function of where you see things. And we do believe, honestly, and this is coming from educators, that this is a better way of looking at how children learn in the Common Core.
What is the evaluation plan for determining success? Will you be surveying higher education institutions and employers to see if the kids are better prepared?
Okay, so we have a business roundtable, the BIA, and several large corporations, organizations are on that business roundtable. We meet, now we're meeting every month. We meet with all our professional organizations, and we meet with parents. And some of you may not be aware of this, I failed to mention it, but unbeknownst to us, 1,500 parents in the state of New Hampshire, on their own, voted for the Common Core. And that information is in the minutes from, I think almost 2.5 years ago, from the then president of the Parent-Teacher Association. If you go onto the Parent-Teacher Association website, it's amazing what parents believe across the country, because they now know what their children need to learn and to be exposed to at every grade level. Parents often work in the dark, and they don't understand it. So when you look at the standards, you have a deeper understanding because they're clearer. You can really understand. Like a kindergartner should know how to count from 0 to 100. Does everyone understand that? Okay, so if your child is only counting to 20 at the end of kindergarten, then we need some concerns. So parents have the parents that have been involved in looking at the Common Core have been very supportive.
Having conceded that the DOE was somewhat remiss in its communication, how do you recommend we communicate as local school boards with the public? And how can the DOE help us such that New Hampshire can move forward?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Is that the last one? But it's a good question. So communication. I mean, the best thing that humans do is communicate. We're not so good at it all the time. It's a lesson. Communicating with your community, opening the doors. We know that the most successful schools in the state of New Hampshire is where the doors are always open to the community. It's there. People have an open door policy. So I think we just all have to keep getting better at it. And the 3 C's are very important for all of us: communication, collaboration, working together, and coherence. Does it really make sense to do this? And if it doesn't, then we need to rethink it. And those 3 C's. So yeah, we'll keep getting better. And I hope that all of us will work more together.
There was an AFT survey and a discussion in terms of New Hampshire. Please discuss in terms of New Hampshire. Only 27% of teachers reported that their districts had provided all or most of the tools they need. 78% in low performing, some, few, or none. Do we have an online portal for advocates? I think I'm ruining this question. What are our online tools? So in effect, what are we doing to help teachers or support teachers? And we have online tools for parents and educators to learn.
Okay. We have, we didn't get into this evening, but we have what's called a network strategy for our teachers and leaders in the state. We've identified priority areas that teachers need a lot of support in terms of learning. And they're available. We do not have a sign-on for parents yet. I can't answer when that would happen because we're just learning as a state how to make sure we communicate with all of our teachers and leaders. But we do not have a blog for parents because in order to have a blog, you need to have someone who is morally, ethically, and intellectually responsible because blogs can, as we all know, get out of control. So we've talked about how could we have more of an exchange online learning, online communication with parents, but we're not there yet. Is there anything you want to add to that for the network strategies?
If New Hampshire is so independent and has local control, why did we have to ask for a waiver?
Well, NCLB was federal law. And if you choose to live in the United States, I mean, I'm not going to get into the politics of this. I think everyone's smart enough to know. That's the way it goes. And so NCLB came into place, and everybody had to jump and had to do it. And then once people lived with it long enough and knew that it failed, then God bless America, because people said, we're not doing it anymore. And that was the waiver, and we did it.
How should school board members respond to myths promoted by certain political and media personalities?
Well, that's a great question. When are they going to end? But so I don't know. I mean, the challenge is to respect everybody. One of the things that I've learned in the last 5 years in this job, I came from higher education, is that I have to be, as a public, some people refer to as a public servant, be willing to listen to everyone's political views and learn to listen and not be so quick to judge. And so that's hard work sometimes.
Excuse me, my question wasn't asked. May I ask that question?
Sure.
I'm Carlos Martinez. I'm on the school board for Alton, New Hampshire. First of all, I'd like to mention that your analogy of someone being shot in this climate, I think, was done in poor taste. But first of all, my question specifically was, what is the cost to not the school district, but to the parents specifically, in order to initiate this. As you might know, Alton has been in the news, and we voted down Common Core as the first city. That was the primary focus for us because we got no answers, and we were very concerned about the cost of the parents because we are concerned about our taxpayers. And the other one was about the data mining, which is you're giving false information, and we have.
I am not giving false information.
So
I am not giving
question.
false
Thank you.
information, and I appreciate your question. And I do think that I answered the question. The cost will remain the same as it currently is with NECAP.
Do you have a number?
I did have a slide. You're
Okay.
welcome to go on the slide. It's $22.50. And you, yeah.
I think that the superintendents in your region probably will have
Hold the mic to your
Can you
mouth.
use the mic, please?
I just, so I think your superintendent will have a meeting in your region to address the questions that you have. But in fact, we are finished. If I didn't read your question, it wasn't intentional. I think I read it quickly and thought it was consistent with some other questions about costs. That's up to the commission.
Sure.
I'm Dr. Julianne Cooper, I'm the president of Girard Academy. And the one thing I don't hear, you can read all of these standards, but none of them discuss what the curriculum is that these standards are being applied to. What are the books that are being read? What is the material?
Well, that's up to the school district or the private school to do it.
Many of the materials that I've seen coming out from some of our kids have Common Core compliant or on the materials. So it's the Common Core compliant materials are being produced for people to teach from. And we've all read about some of the materials that we're seeing come out that are being used. The president's executive orders or, so the quality of what is being used to determine these standards is far more important than sitting and reading these standards that are very repetitive and yes, the student should be able to read and write and talk and so forth. But what are they reading, writing, and talking about? And where is that material coming from?
That's totally the choice of the independent school, the public school, or whatever other school there is to select the materials, and they're not compliance, they are aligned with Common Core. And so it's up to the district to select whatever materials that they choose. There is no
But they selected
requirement.
the Common Core aligned
They have selected their materials for as long as New Hampshire has had state standards. Their curriculum, their materials, and so on and so forth. Nothing has changed.
So if it says that they have to have 50% of informational text, where does the decision, I mean, first of all, why 50%? But then where is that 50% coming from?
That's up to the district, the school, to decide how they want that informational text, at least 50%. There's a huge concern about too much fiction for children. They need to have a better understanding of information. They need to understand documentary activities differently. So that's where that's coming from.
With this Common Core, there's an incredible amount of local attention by the educators who are paid to the content. You really have to apply their judgment. It's no longer a book that you start on page 1 and continue through page 400. First, I should have said something at the beginning, but I'll say something now. I want to thank Tim Mays, the superintendent here in Bedford, the Bedford Board, Bill Hagan, the principal of Salem High School, for making this beautiful facility. Bedford High School. What did I say? I was just checking to see who was paying attention, and you were paying attention. Yes. Actually, I was thinking I could see myself standing on a floor like this in Salem. Beautiful facility. Thank Tim Mays, the superintendent of Bedford, Bill Hagan, the principal of Bedford High School, and the Bedford School Board for making this beautiful auditorium, the Bedford School District, available to the South Central Superintendents and School Boards. I want to thank all the South Central folks for coming tonight. I think it's been a good show of support, and it's a testament to your interest in making good decisions in your districts for your kids. As the Commissioner said not too long ago, it's about student learning, engaging learners, and then measuring that achievement, making some decisions about how to do better. So I want to thank the Commissioner, Dr. Berry, for taking your time. It wasn't easy.
New Hampshire Commissioner of Education Virginia Berry gave yet another PowerPoint presentation on the Common Core state standards to a gathering of New Hampshire School Administrators Association at Bedford High last night. Approximately 90 school board members and district staffers from the South Central region were in attendance, as more than 80 ordinary citizens who were hoping to get long-standing questions about Common Core answered. The night got off to a bad start when Association President Michael Delahanty, Salem's superintendent, told Hooksett State Senator David Booten he could not ask questions or make comments because that was only for school district personnel that could, and I quote, make decisions. In saying with due respect that he too was in a position to make decisions, Booten said he thought it was a public meeting, to which Delahanty said it was, but only association members would be allowed to participate. Sorry, state senators don't count. One of the night's more interesting exchanges took place between Manchester Mayor Ted Gatsas and Commissioner Berry. During her presentation, Berry said the waiver that was being used to give New Hampshire the opportunity to implement the Common Core gave the state of New Hampshire a 2-year reprieve from the requirements of the No Child Left Behind law. She said, all but said, ruined public education. Gatsas asked when the clock began to tick and when it would expire. It looks like it expires at the end of 2015's school year. He also asked what happens if it's not extended, to which Berry said, I don't know, and that they deal with it 2 years from now. In follow-up, Gatsas mentioned that Manchester once upon a time built schools without classroom walls when it was all the rage. Now, he said, it's not the rage anymore, but we still have schools without classroom walls, and that wasn't a good thing. He questioned why the state would change everything, knowing it could go away in less than 2 years. After the meeting, he said that just didn't make sense to him. Finally, Berry admitted again that school districts do not have to adopt Common Core, but she also said that the State Board of Education had not adopted Common Core, that it had only endorsed it, which is why it's voluntary. Well, that got my email box filled with minutes of the July 8th, 2010 meeting of the board, where it clearly says, and I quote, Daphne Kenyon made the motion, seconded by Tom Raffio, that the State Board of Education adopt in principle the final draft of the Common Core state standards and that the Department of Education commit to a thoughtful, orderly transition process for implementation and assessment to ensure that all New Hampshire students experience a successful and productive future. The vote went 4-1 with Chairman Lyons opposed. He expressed, quote, significant concerns over the process, end quote. Those emails also referenced the waiver application to No Child Left Behind, noting the state had adopted Common Core. And gee, it was Virginia Berry who signed that application.